Welcome to this training session on writing and autistic spectrum disorder. It's a really common observation that children on the autistic spectrum often struggle with their writing skills or can be really unwilling to write. However, interestingly, there's very little information out there about this and very little academic research. So during this session, we're going to be covering very quickly what autism is. Secondly, we're going to look at the complexity of the skill of writing and all of the elements that are involved in that. Then we're going to consider all the reasons that writing might be really difficult for children with autistic spectrum disorder. And finally, we're going to consider what things might help. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that seems to impact about 1% of the population. It's made up of impairments within 3 different areas, and this is something that Lorna Wing called the triad of impairments. So we've got difficulties within social communication, which is things like difficulty processing language, delayed language skills, poor shared attention, difficulty with understanding tone, sarcasm, body language. We've also got difficulties within the area of social interaction, which is difficulties with social skills and maybe not picking up on implicit cues from others and needing explicit teaching for those social skills. Difficulties with understanding emotions and the thoughts of other people and being able to read other people, and difficulties with regulating anxiety. We've also then got difficulties with social imagination, which means a difficulty in thinking about the past and being able to then predict the future, which means that changes can be really, really unsettling. Difficulty creating something entirely from imagination, struggling to see a big picture and tending to focus on small details, and just being generally quite absorbed within areas of special interest. So those 3 are the triad of impairment, but it's later been recognised that actually sensory processing difficulties impact on 95% of people with autism. And so that's a key part of it as well. And sensory processing is either over or under stimulation in different areas of our senses. So it may be sensitivity to certain noises or textures or tastes, and sometimes even things like proprioceptive awareness, which is our awareness of ourselves within space. So having talked about all of those difficulties, it's fair to say that not all children on the autistic spectrum will struggle with all of those difficulties to the same extent. So they need to have difficulties in all 3 of those areas in order to be given a diagnosis. However, rather than now thinking about an autistic spectrum in a linear way, going from not very autistic to very autistic, we will now think about the autistic spectrum as a circle, as shown in this diagram, where you might have quite significant difficulty in an area such as sensory processing, but then no difficulties in the area of motor skills. And so this is a much more helpful way to think of it. And it means that in terms of writing, some children on the autistic spectrum will be significantly affected and other children less so. So just to focus specifically on writing for a moment, it's a hugely complex skill, which involves lots of different processes. And as we grow older and get better at writing, a lot of those parts of the process become automatic. So spelling, for example, we don't have to think about as we're writing. Letter formation, we don't have to think about, which frees us up to think about some of the other elements of the process. But for children, when they're first learning to write, there are so many things that they need to consider. And here's just a list for you of just some of those things. So they're using visual motor coordination, spelling skills, sentence construction, letter formation, choosing vocabulary, sensory integration, so actually being aware of where their hand is in space, and also the integration of that feeling of the pen against the paper and how hard and how soft you need to be able to press. Organisation of your work, planning, editing, generating language that you want to use to convey what you're trying to say, spacing, and also understanding the reader and what they're going to want to hear. So why is writing often so much more difficult for children on the autistic spectrum? As I said before, there's very little research into this area, but in 2018 there was a study by Finnegan and Accardo that actually compared children on the autistic spectrum with neurotypical children and looked at their writing. And what they found was that the length of the children with on the autistic spectrum, the length of the writing was shorter, the legibility was poorer, The size was bigger, the speed was slower, the spelling was significantly worse, and the structure was more difficult to follow. So we know there are differences, and we see it every day that there are differences. But why? Why are there those differences that we see? And every child with autism, they're all different from each other. There might be things that they have in common, but they're all different. And so there are lots of different reasons that could be at play here. And I've just going to talk you through 13 different reasons that there could be. So really it's down to you to then explore which reasons you think could be behind the difficulties that the child that you're working with might have. So the first one we're going to talk about is something called executive functioning difficulties. So research tells us that children on the autistic spectrum often have an impairment with their executive functioning, and these are the skills that take place in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So it's things like planning, organising, shifting your attention from one thing to another, controlling our impulses, emotional regulation, and crucially, something called working memory. Now, working memory is the ability to be doing or thinking about something whilst also manipulating that information within your brain. So we really need that when we're writing, because when we're writing, we're thinking about so many different things. We're thinking about our handwriting and our letter formation. We're thinking about how we're holding our pen. We're thinking about our spelling. We're thinking about the content and what we're trying to convey to the reader. So we really rely on those executive functions like working memory, planning, organising, all crucial for writing. The second one to talk about is something called weak central coherence. So this is the idea that children on the autistic spectrum tend to be absolutely brilliant at really focusing in on fine details, but maybe less great at being able to see the bigger picture and sort of form all of those processes together. And clearly with writing, again, as we've got so many different processes, it can be that children on the autistic spectrum get really transfixed with one particular part of the process, maybe their spelling, which means that the rest then just becomes really overwhelming and frustrating. The third one to talk about is something called theory of mind, which is the idea that children on the autistic spectrum find it quite difficult to be able to read the minds of others or kind of understand what somebody else might be thinking and infer those thoughts. And that's really difficult when in writing we're often telling children to think about how somebody might be feeling or put themselves in another character's footsteps and be able to write from that perspective. The next thing to talk about is fine motor difficulties. Often with ASD, there are comorbidities, which means other difficulties which happen kind of coincide. And things like hypermobility is really common, which is kind of a lack of the muscle tone within the fingers or the hands or the wrists, and something called dysgraphia, which is sort of a severe difficulty with specifically with writing. As we said before, the difficulties with social imagination can mean that sometimes children become quite absorbed within their interests and more reluctant to write about something that's outside of those interests, which can play a role in writing difficulties. Also, language difficulties can be a huge barrier. We know that often with children with ASD, their receptive language and expressive language is delayed, which can have an impact on their ability to write. Due to anxiety, sometimes children on the autistic spectrum can be quite demand avoidant, which means that they're very reluctant to do things that they're told to do by somebody else, and that creates a huge amount of anxiety, which again can be an issue when they're being told in the classroom to write. Moving on to sensory issues. For many children on the autistic spectrum, they do have sensory sensitivities, which can mean that holding a pen can feel incredibly painful, or the feeling of the paper can be like sandpaper against their skin. So it's really worthwhile taking into account those kind of sensory issues when thinking about writing. Often what we see with children on the autistic spectrum is that their cognitive profile is quite spiky. So they may have areas of real strength and then areas that are more difficult, like writing. And often what we see is quite a lot of perfectionism, where children are trying to write what's in their minds, but actually what's in their minds and their creativity and imagination and what they want to convey just doesn't quite come across on the paper. And when it's there, on the paper and their handwriting isn't as they want it to be and their spelling isn't as they want it to be, that can become very frustrating. So perfectionism is sometimes an issue. Along the lines of the sensory issues, often when we're asking children to write, it also means that we're asking them to sit for an extended period of time, which can be difficult for some children. Due to the difficulties with social imagination, sometimes the tasks that we ask children to do are just too abstract. We're asking them to infer things, we're asking them to talk about people's feelings, and that can just be a bit too difficult sometimes. On to anxiety. Often, because writing is such a difficult thing, children on the autistic spectrum can build up a bit of anxiety about writing, and that creates a bigger barrier than any of those other difficulties. So, reducing that anxiety is crucial. And finally, research tells us that in the early years, neurotypical children generally enjoy being read to. However, where there are difficulties with the receptive language skills, the joint and shared attention, and sometimes the intent to socialise with others on their agenda, children with autism may have less of an intrinsic interest in reading and writing. And this makes it really important to explicitly point out the purpose of writing and how that relates to them. So now on what we can do to help. The first crucial thing to do is to try to tease out which particular bit it is that's holding them back and then try to intervene appropriately. So these first three steps are all things that might be useful if you feel that the child is having difficulty with their fine motor skills, and that's what is holding them back with the actual process of handwriting. So the first thing you could try is to practice writing on vertical surfaces, which is really good for strengthening the muscle tone in the wrists and hands. So it might be that you get them to paint at home with water and a brush on fence panels, or it could be that at school they try writing on an easel, and those things can really help. Also, there are all manner of different pen grips that might be helpful in helping maybe the sensory sensitivity of holding a pen. And also Play-Doh can be really useful, or Theraputty in different textures to be able to strengthen the hands. If you feel that the child has sensory needs, or maybe finds it really difficult to sit still for quite a long time to be able to write, then movement breaks are really important. So especially things that incorporate what we call heavy work, which is maybe holding all the books and distributing the books before you start writing, or maybe lifting a few chairs, doing some chair push-ups so they don't even have to move from their seat, or reaching up really high and pushing against the wall. All of those things are quite a nice sensory movement break before you start writing, and then taking regular breaks in between. If you feel that perhaps the barrier is that the child's just become really anxious and just decided that they just hate writing and it's really hard and they don't want to do it anymore, it's so important to bring back the fun. So it may be for young children doing things that don't involve having to write on a page, but instead writing in sand trays or putting shaving foam into a Ziploc bag and then writing the letters in that. It could be that you allow them to use lots of different pens or different colours, or experiment with different surfaces. So it might be that they're writing in chalk on the floor, like the little boy in the picture. Or it could even be, there are some brilliant things like this illuminated writing surface for the child at the top of the screen there. That's really brilliant, and also it takes away that anxiety, because if they're not happy with what they've done, they can wipe it out and it's not there as permanently as it might feel with pen and paper. If you have a child who's quite demand avoidant, providing options is a really good method to try and allow them to feel that actually they're in control, and therefore they'll feel less anxious. So maybe choosing which colours they want to use, or choosing where they do the writing. You might even use things like clipboards to be able to say, do you want to do your writing task in the classroom, or do you want to go and sit outside and do it? Or do you want to go and sit in this corner and do it on your clipboard? Which also creates a vertical surface as well, depending on how it's held. So that can be a really good method. Also with children who are quite demand avoidant, doing things where they're showing you what to do and they're sort of teaching you can be quite good, because then it's not you asking them, it's them showing you. And that can be really, really useful. Or also setting challenges where you say things like, this is really, really hard. I don't think you'll be able to do this before I get back. Let's see, and then walk away and then see if they're able to do it, because often that's a really good motivator. And the final thing is to try to relate it to their interests. If it's that they're a bit unwilling to move outside of things they're interested in, relate it to their interests, because that's going to be a huge motivator. And also relate it to their experiences, because if they can write about a character who they can relate to and where they can use their own experiences to draw out the feelings of that character, that's going to make it a lot less abstract and a lot easier for them to do. So onto a few more strategies. So if you've got a child who really is struggling with their working memory skills, talking through with an adult first or with a peer is brilliant, because again, it helps them to rehearse what they're going to say first. So it helps them with that sentence formation and the flow of the writing before they put pen to paper, which reduces the demands on their working memory. Talking tins are also brilliant, where they record words so that they can talk into the tins and then they can play it back while they write it. So that reduces the demands on the working memory. And just try to break the task down. So think about what specific skill is it that I really want them to work on today, whether that be punctuation or spelling or sentence structure, and just try to reduce the demands on the other processes within the writing. So providing them things like graphic organisers that you can see an example of there, or sentence starters, or giving them the spelling so that they're not having to worry about the spellings. Just making sure that you give them all those other parts of the puzzle so that they can focus their attention on the bit that you really want to work on. Help them to get started. Often starting a task is the most difficult bit, and once they've started, they're away. So it might be that for some children, just marking a little X on their work where you want them to start can be quite helpful in helping them to organise their thoughts and get started. It might be that with young children you do a bit of hand over hand to start them off. And then moving on to the tag team approach. So for some children where they're not very willing to do their writing, it might be that you say, okay, I'm going to do a bit and then I'm going to pass it over to you. And again, for those ones where they struggle to get started, that can be really good if you start it and then pass it over. Or for those children where the first and then approach works quite well, you might want to say, okay, first you do a little bit, and then when you've had enough, you can pass it over to me and I'll do a bit, and then you do a bit and then I do a bit. And it can just make it mean that it takes away some of those barriers. Also thinking about some alternative ways to record their ideas. Do you need them always to write down on paper? Do you need them to explicitly be writing down on paper to show you the skills that they've got? So it might be worth thinking sometimes about other ways that they can record their ideas. It might be that they come up with a lovely creative story and somebody else writes it out for them. So it might be that somebody sits and writes it for them or types it onto a computer. It might be that they record it into a dictaphone. It might be that they act it out. It might be that they just tell it to a peer. So try to give them other ways of recording their skills so that there isn't that physical barrier of handwriting constantly there. And it may even be that for some older children that typing is brilliant, because again, it takes away so many of those parts of the process that we talked about before, the handwriting, the letter formation, all of that, it takes that away. And it's also very easily deletable for those children who are just perfectionists and can't bear to see their writing on a page. It can be really good for those children. And then finally, give them or try to start them off with really concrete and purposeful tasks that they see the point of, and that don't involve all of that abstract thinking and inferring. So it might be writing instructions, so them teaching you how to do something that's within their area of interest. It might be that they're writing down a recipe for something that they love to eat, or it could be writing a letter asking for something that they really, really want. And all of those things, they're likely to see the purpose of it and be motivated to do it. So that brings us to the end of this session, but I just wanted to share a few websites with you that you might find helpful moving forwards. So there's one called the OT Toolbox. So if you do have a child who's really struggling either with sensory issues or with the fine motor skills, then they have lots of really creative exercises for you to try. And also this website, the readingrockets.org, they have a page that's really brilliant on explaining lots of different types of assistive technology that there are out there to provide alternatives to having to always write everything by hand. So thank you very much for listening, and do email me anytime if you have any questions. So my email address is a.demario@xaviercet.org.uk. Thank you.